Okay, let's get going. Welcome to Dr. Data Science and this year's webinar series, which is the true story of a data science project. And I'll welcome a special guest, a frequent visitor to Dr. Data Science, Nico Rode.
Thanks, Steve. Good to be here.
Great. So, as usual, we appear on the third Wednesday of each month. 9 o'clock in the morning here in California. So our next session will be on May 19th. And we are today covering the next phase of our data science project. If you want to find out some information about the previous phases of this real world project that's been going on for some time now, you can check out our YouTube channel. You can also find all our previous recordings of the Dr. Data Science session on a whole host of different subjects in data science. It's a really fun way to get to know some perhaps slightly less commonly used techniques in data science. So just search for Dr. Data Science from TIBCO on YouTube.
Sorry, Stephen, the TIBCO Data Science YouTube channel is linked in the chat, so easy for you to
Awesome. Go. Great. Okay, yeah, click on that and take a look. So as I said, this month we're going to be focusing on the clustering phase, which was the first phase of the project where we started to really get some insights from the data. In our previous sessions, we've talked about the project itself and what we were actually trying to do, and some of the early techniques we used for cleansing data, transforming data into something suitable for the types of activities we're going to be talking about today. So just to catch you up very briefly on the story so far, this project in a sense, uses very standard techniques, clustering, regressions, predictive modeling, random forests, sampling techniques, big data techniques, model testing, and so on. So everything that we're covering in this series, we think is pretty general, but it is about a very specific use case, which is looking at quality control and yield management for wafers of memory chips going through a factory. And at the end of that process, the various tests are run and you have these patterns that emerge. Most of the time they look like these sort of like blank blue wafers that you see on the Spotfire dashboard there. But often you have these patterns essentially indicating that something's gone wrong, rings around the edge or half moon shape or heart shape or scratch, indicates something's gone wrong in the manufacturing process. And we want to track those down and find out why they happened. That's really the purpose of this project. And it can save millions of dollars on a regular basis. So, as I said, in previous sessions, we've talked a little bit about how we've cleansed the data that we get that maps out these wafer map patterns. And what was the next phase of the project, Nico? You were involved right at the beginning there. What was the problem that we were actually trying to solve?
Right. Yeah. It always starts with the problem, right? And the problem here is a pretty big one. I mean, like you said, Stephen, we're trying to find patterns on wafers, right? But we're trying to do that because there's tremendous business value there. Like you said, the core idea here is to find those patterns and then sort of track backwards, right, as to what went wrong in the manufacturing process. But there's also a forward-looking business value, which is, can we predict where these dice on the wafer might do best in individual products, right? Because there's a whole process of slicing and dicing. So the problem here is large and quite valuable. If you can track one of these issues down, you can save millions and millions of dollars. Right. And so when we thought about it, of where to start, really we put ourselves in the shoes of a process engineer, somebody on the fab floor who's looking at these wafers as they come in. And what we wanted to do was give them a very simple way of finding similar wafers, right? So if they know that a pattern on a wafer is problematic, basically just press a button in Spotfire and get a list of all of the wafers in the database that look like that pattern. And that's where we sort of intuitively came up with clustering. Seemed like a very good place to start. It's a simple place to start, but that's usually a good thing when you're first starting out on a data science project. Is you don't need to jump right into neural networks or some sort of opaque data science solution. Of course, the irony here is, we ultimately ended up doing exactly that. But still, I think there's value in starting with something simple. And that's where we started with just regular K-means clustering, right? This is something that you learn about sort of in your first data science class, right? Or even in computer science, you're familiar with K-means clustering. But the idea is, could we take these wafers that have 733 dice on them, and could we just put them through K-means clustering? And if we have a query vector, right, can we find different clusters or groups of similar looking wafers?
So the idea then is to use clustering as a way of saying, well, most wafers just look like this, where all the tests pass, but there are some where the patterns are kind of similar. And if you want to find things where you don't know what those patterns are initially, but you want to find things that have similar patterns, well, that sounds exactly like clustering, right? It's unsupervised because we don't know, and it finds things that are similar. Yeah, sounds like
exactly. Yeah. And this slide is just sort of a vomit of information on what clustering is. But the basic idea, right, is you have a simple example here, two-dimensional grid. You have these data points spread out. You basically put K number of clusters or points on there, and you sort of average those clusters out depending on the values of the data points, right? And you get to a spot where at the end, once you've iterated through and those points aren't moving anymore, you have definite clusters. Now this is an easy example here, right? B, the image, but often it's not that simple, right? You don't have just two variables, and you don't have just three great clusters to look at.
Yeah.
And you have to go through an evaluation process. Right. So an evaluation process to see, does clustering make sense, and are you doing it well?
What was our evaluation process in this project? I mean, were we actually just looking at these clusters and see if they made sense?
Yeah, we tried doing both. So we had two methods that were sort of mathematical. Down at the bottom there, silhouette score and done index.
Okay.
So these are two metrics that are pretty common inside of the clustering world. But basically, the done index, they're both metrics for judging the quality of clustering, right? You want to make sure that what a good cluster is clusters that are tight. They don't have much dispersion throughout them, but clusters that are separate or distinct from other clusters around it. Okay. And this is actually kind of a tough problem, right? Because you don't know what the best number of K is, right? You don't know how many clusters to do at first, and you don't know if your data is really suited for clustering. Mm-hmm. But the done index, for example, is I'm just looking at my notes here. It's the minimum intercluster distance. So inside of a cluster, how far away are the individual points from each other?
That's intra-cluster, minimum intra-cluster, the first one in your diagram there on the left. So
right.
Getting the cluster to be as tight as possible. Yeah, got it.
Yeah, and it's the ratio of that over the inter-cluster distance, right? So how far is a point from the closest cluster?
And you want that to be as big as possible, right?
Yeah, so the done index
ratio then, small on top, big on the bottom. Overall, the done index, we want to try and get the small value.
Yeah, versus the silhouette score is the opposite, right? It's a measure from -1 to 1. 1 is that you have great clusters. They're small, compact, they're distinct from each other. 0 is basically insignificant. Your clustering doesn't make much sense. And then a -1 is, you basically inverse, right? You've assigned wrong clusters. The difference between the two is silhouette score also compares a cluster to itself, right? So the major difference is it's still a ratio. You're still comparing inter versus intra. But what it does is just compares itself to its mean centroid and uses that as a sort of a heuristic instead. Okay,
so we've got these metrics that some ratio, big or small, comparing the sort of tightness and the separation, and we applied them in this case, and what happened?
We sucked. Our clustering was not great. And it was interesting because we went through a visual process first, right? Like we did the clustering and then we just wanted to put it on a map and see how we did. And we got interesting patterns. Like it wasn't awful. We did this clustering and we found definite, patterns and clusters that looked really similar, right? You can see some of the examples here of an all plaid pattern, big blobs, sort of a weird geometric pattern on the bottom left. But the bottom line was that, we could get these big, sort of obvious patterns, but a lot of the nuance was missing.
And if I remember rightly, we actually, as I've mentioned in the past, there's actually sort of an amalgamation of a couple of projects we've been working, but one of the clients that we spoke to had actually issued us a challenge, right? Not just a purely numerical challenge with done indexes, whatever.
Right. Yeah, the challenge was, it was pretty cool, honestly, from the client side. They basically said, we have a pattern in here in this giant data set that is distinct, right? It's a legitimate pattern that causes us issues, right? We know what it is. We want to see if you can come up with a way to find it. So that was sort of the bar for this whole thing, right? Is can we make these methods and these clustering ideas to be able to find that pattern and confidently bring it back to them?
Yeah.
So again,
I assume the Kmeans did not find that pattern.
No, it did not.
Okay.
It did not. But it found some interesting ones. That's for sure.
Yeah.
And so I think the next step that we went through here was just sort of analyzing, right? Like, okay, well, this didn't work. Why didn't it work? What can we do? And the main thing that we sort of converged on was the data was just too complex. I mentioned earlier, and we have like 700 dice for each wafer. So if you're doing K-means, it's 700 dimensionality, right? And it's too big. And you also notice there's a lot of garbage in here too, right? A lot of null values, a lot of just sort of noise.
Yeah, we mentioned that on some previous sessions, right? That there's a lot of null values here, and we needed to do something with those. Adam talked on our last session, I think it was, around Bessel functions. So how did the Bessel functions help here?
The Bessel functions were the trump card. Before we started doing Bessel functions, we did sort of mean imputation, right? Because a lot of dimensionality reduction techniques just can't handle null values, right? Like SVD is a classic one where we couldn't implement it because we had so many null values. So what we did first was doing mean imputation or sort of null resistant methods of SVD. One of the best examples is eigenface on the left-hand side, where it's sort of a modified SVD or modified PCA. It's traditionally used for images, which is how we treated a lot of this data. You think of an image, I mean, it's just X, Y coordinates and pixel values, right? So that's essentially what these wafers are too. So sort of a unique, sort of interesting approach on eigenface, where we tried to decompose these wafers into principal components and then cluster those. And you see the results on the left-hand side. They're better, right? I mean, like those clusters make sense, and visually you look at them, and they look pretty darn good, honestly.
Yeah.
A different approach we tried too was not clustering, but it's called FACE. It's the Facebook AI similarity search. Because if you think about it, our initial problem here or goal was press a button, find most similar wafers. It is a clustering problem, but it's also just a similarity search, right? So the FACE algorithm is just Euclidean distance, highly optimized Euclidean distance from a query vector or a target wafer to everything else in the data set. And then we just bring back, top end values and right, just trying to find these clusters, which also brought back sort of intermediate results. That's when we found the Bessel functions. And the Bessel functions sort of changed everything, honestly. So to give you sort of an intuitive explanation of it.
And we did go through this last month, so you can assume we're all up to speed on Bessel functions.
Okay, I made the slide, so I just kind of want to show it off.
It's a beautiful slide.
Just a quick recap if you're tuning in. Bessel functions are basically an extension of the Fourier transform, right? So you have an input signal, which is our wafer. You decompose it into different base signals. Those base signals are on the bottom left. Then you can recompose any wafer as a linear combination of some magnitude times that basis function. And what this does is it just gives you a great way to describe the wafers in a much more defined space, right? So instead of 700 dice, you can describe a wafer in just 100 coefficients is basically what it is. But where this really helped us is with null values. So we could do this on really dirty data with no values. And in the end, we'd sort of spit out a clean version of it, a clean version of coefficients guaranteed not to be null. And then we're in a totally different headspace, right? Because now all of a sudden you can do SVD, you can do further dimensionality reduction that we were sort of limited to before. So again, Vessel functions game changer.
And this sort of radial nature of them means that they were sort of particularly well. I mean, Bessel functions are like the sort of radial version of these Fourier transforms, which are just one-dimensional sines and cosines building up this one-dimensional time series. Here we've got these sort of 2 dimensions radiating out. And it fills in its null values, so we can do the reduction dimensionality. So we've got smaller data. It recognizes sort of these circular type patterns. Makes a ton of sense. It was an inspired choice.
Yeah. And so then we sort of went back to ground zero, right? Of doing Kmeans again and doing done, right? And then we had sort of another intuition, another sort of brain blast, if you will, about a different kind of clustering. And it's something that, you know, maybe isn't thought of as traditional clustering. It's not in the same field, I guess, as K-means, right? But it's something known as the self-organizing map.
Before you get there, Nico, I'm remembering also that we used hierarchical clustering, which is sort of perhaps a little more similar to K-means.
That's right.
And I don't think we were really using that as sort of the end goal. Remind me what we used that for.
That's right. So we use that as another way to organize the data, right? Because now we are getting to a point where, right, we could do K-means, we could reduce the dimensionality and sort of make the data manageable, but we still had, you know, thousands and thousands of wafers, and we just needed a way to organize that really and to visualize it.
Yeah.
And so we did hierarchical clustering, where we reduced the dimensionality, and then we would do sort of a dendrogram, right, of branching outwards of all these different wafers, and you could interact with them and select a branch, which would essentially act as a cluster, right? Because you would start from a single tree and branch downwards, and you could sort of filter as you go down, sort of segmenting the wafers into distinct clusters. I do have a demo. I don't have it up right available, so I can go into that if you want.
No, the self-organizing maps are really fascinating, but I think people should check out hierarchical clustering if they're not familiar with it. It is, it's nice. I think we used it in this sort of exploratory way that you mentioned, where we can just go down through the, you start off with 2 clusters, and maybe that works well, and then breaks it up into more clusters, and maybe that works well. You still, in the end, have to decide where you're going to settle on that dendrogram of clusters. And so, in that sense, it suffers from that same problem that Kmeans clustering does, and it's more exploratory in nature, but it was powerful, I think, for us at least to visualize that the Bessel functions are doing the right thing. I think that's sort of where it helped us, really, is it told us we were moving in the right direction.
Totally, yeah. It was sort of a sanity check, right? Of okay, all of these individual branches make a ton of sense, right? And it would even be for wafers that you'd have to look really closely to sort of manually put them into a grouping or a cluster. But the combination of the Bessel coefficients and the clustering, hierarchical clustering, just did such a great job of organizing them, really. And Stephen, I don't know if you remember, but we did a demo or a talk at reInvent on this. So if you're interested, I'm sure you can just Google, TIBCO reInvent wafer maps, and you can go and see it. It's a very cool demo.
Yeah, that's right. That's a great idea. Yeah, go and check that out, because we go into the clustering there, particularly the hierarchical clustering, in depth, and Spotfire does a beautiful job of sort of mapping out these clusters. And so that's not where we ended up. So why did we move on to the self-organizing maps? Why didn't we just stick with the hierarchical clusters?
Yeah, that's a good question. There's a few reasons. One is that it's really the major one, or major two, is that the hierarchical clustering doesn't scale great.
Mm-hmm.
It works well for smaller amounts of wafers, and it looks really nice and slick. But the ultimate goal here was to run this on thousands of wafers, right?
Yeah,
and
just totally lights out, no user input required.
Exactly. Yeah. Right. And again, like with K-means, there's manual input required there for hierarchical, right? You really do have to filter down and get your hands dirty to a certain extent. So we wanted something a little more hands-off and scaled better, and maybe just a little bit more sophisticated than hierarchical. So of course we went to a neural network, which is a self-organizing map. I think that's the interesting thing about it is it's actually a type of neural network. It's a super simple one, right? You have an input, you have your weights, and then you have an output. But in the end, it's still a neural network.
I see.
But it is interesting. It's similar to K-means, and I'll sort of walk through the intuition behind it, and you'll sort of get flashbacks to K-means, but it is different and it sort of diverges. So we'll start with just a really simple example here. You have your data points on the left, just two-dimensional grid, right? And then you have your neural network on the right, and it's just two neurons. So each neuron has a weight associated to it. And if you're familiar with K-means, you can think of these weights as those initial cluster points, right? So they'll be on the grid. And as you sort of iterate through or you train, each epoch, you go to a data point and you just update the location of these weights, right? So the red one is closer, the green one is closer, you'll bring both of them in. Whereas K-means you'd sort of assign it to a cluster, right? But here you're just updating the weights. So you'll bring them closer, you go to the next data point, you update the weights again, right? Next one, update them again, so on and so forth, right? So you can sort of imagine going through this and you get through the entire data set. And then you assign the data points to the nearest weight. Okay. And then all of a sudden that's its cluster. So those top 5 would be in that cluster, top cluster, bottom 4 be in the red cluster. Now, of course, this gets a little more interesting if you add more neurons, right? More clusters, more data. We're still going to stick with 2 dimensions for now. But again, it gets even more interesting if you have more dimensions, right? But it's a similar thing, right? Each neuron will have a weight on the grid. And we're just going to assume that we're running through everything, right? So as we get to the end here, each data point is assigned to a different neuron, right? And you have clusters on the grid assigned by the data points. And the really important thing here is you have this neural network on the right, and each neuron is sort of geographically important, if that makes sense. So you'll notice neuron 8 in the bottom left is geographically the data point in the bottom left. You'll notice neuron number 4 on the top right is geographically the neurons on the top right. And so what this does is it sort of adds a different dimension, a different layer to your clustering, where yes, you have these clusters, but the clusters are spatially important or spatially relevant to each other. So what this looks like in practice is, we did this on our wafers, and we took this graph, this neural network, and we basically pasted it on a Spotfire dashboard. So practically speaking.
So you're saying sort of the layout of those neurons, or what we're calling clusters here, is significant itself. It's not just this is just some set of clusters devoid of any meaning. The way that they are spaced is actually significant itself. So we actually laid those out on the dashboard in this way? Exactly.
So you can imagine here, our neural network is 35 nodes. We have 35 clusters. And cluster 22, 23, 28, 29, those contain similar wafers, right? So they're independent clusters, but if you go into them, they'll likely contain patterns that look similar, right? And you'll notice in the top left, it's the same thing for that sort of top left row or column, I mean. And so what we're seeing here is the centroid of those clusters. So if I were to go in, like on this next slide, and select cluster 21 on the top left, that's a neuron in a self-organizing map. And everything on the bottom left are wafers that were grouped or clustered into that neuron. And so it just gives a really easy way for an end user or process engineer to sift through thousands of wafers, right? Because it's so visually intuitive of, okay, these 4 clusters over here are all similar. Let me sort of explode into it and investigate it and see if I can make sense of the wafers inside of these clusters.
So it's not just that in this case, the wafers in that particular cluster are similar. Obviously they are, they all have the string pattern, but in the self-organizing map upstairs, you've got other ring-like clusters around that.
Yeah.
And so if you think back to the original goal of this, right, the idea, as you said, is this process engineer can sort of start grouping these things together. Because, I think one of the themes, right, that you've pointed out in this project is that it's this interaction between the human and the machine learning in the background, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's really what we learned throughout, is to build a really powerful solution, you do need the combination of human and machine, right? You need that subject matter expert. You need sort of that human element to get the most out of the machine learning, right? To get the most out of these data science techniques. And if you combine the two, I mean, you get a very powerful solution that is sort of symbiotic, right? The human helps the machine, helps the algorithm sort of learn, right? And gives it information, and then it feeds right back to the user in sort of an end goal or end use case.
Got it. Okay. So is that where we ended up?
That was just beginning. We went through sort of that whole iteration of how do we find similar wafers, right? And then we did the clusterings, we did dimensionality reduction, we sort of ended up on self-organizing maps. But then really what we did is use the self-organizing maps as a springboard, right? Like we just talked about of sort of the combination of human and machine. Self-organizing maps gives the process engineer a great place to start. They can see these clusters and groupings, and then the user can take those groupings and train a traditional machine learning model. In our case, we're training a random forest model, but they take the results of the self-organizing map and just label them, batch label, and then sort of an iterative model training process. Then they can find similar wafers after they train the model in real time or in batch. So it's a much more full solution as opposed to just clustering. It's sort of where we ended up.
Cool. Well, we'll learn all about that in the future sessions. Just a couple of minutes at the end here to take some questions. One question. Somebody's asking here about whether we ever looked at template matching. I'm not sure if you're familiar with template matching. I'm not super familiar with it, but I think it's used for image processing, and it sort of is about sort of finding particular features within images in sort of manufacturing quality control. Interesting. So no, we didn't look at that. It's a good question. Maybe it's something we should take a look at. But we did think a little bit about how we could extract common features, because often in these wafers, right, if I remember right, Nico, you can have superimposed patterns, right? You might have scratch superimposed on a sort of donut shape. What were our thoughts on sort of extracting features in that way?
Yeah, we also talked about doing a convolutional neural network, right? To try to, again, process these as images and bring out different patterns in the wafer. But you're right, Steve. I mean, definitely one of the things is having 2 patterns on one wafer. And I think what we decided to do or explore was basically just keep it the same, right? To train these models, but train multiple models, right? So if you have 2 patterns, one is a ring and one is a scratch, you train 2 separate models to recognize those. And then you score all the wafers, and then you basically look at the confidence scores. So if a wafer has a high confidence for a wafer or for a ring and a high confidence for a scratch, we can be pretty sure that it has both patterns on it.
Yeah. I remember one thing we have spoken about but haven't looked into yet, as far as I remember, is the idea that, well, by using the Bessel functions, which are essentially like a vector space, sort of a set of basis vectors for a vector space. And also with the dimensionality reduction, where we have these components, right? It really, we can see it actually in the basis functions that get created. You can see that they represent some of these individual subpatterns.
That's right.
So that's yeah, go ahead.
And well, yeah, that, and even a step further, right, is when we would do SVD on the Bessel functions, you know, we would actually plot the modes of variation. And sometimes those modes would be very clear of a pattern, right? You know, 90, yeah, not 90, some percentage of the variance would be displayed or represented by a ring pattern in some of these. And that was very clear to see when we look at the modes.
Yeah. Yeah, so good question. We'll look into template matching, but again, some of these techniques that we've used do lend themselves to this idea of decomposing an image into its constituent subpatterns. I guess another question is, let's have a look here. So this was, well, maybe you already answered this one a little bit. Have there been any changes in our approach since what we did at the beginning of the project? Are we still using the self-organizing maps? Are we still using these transformation techniques?
Yeah, I'd say by and large, we're using all of the same techniques that we sort of converged on. One of the things that we are sort of looking into changing is the way that this is processed and the amount of data, of, you know, basically taking this as a standalone dashboard, Spotfire dashboard, and exploding it out to handle much broader amounts of data, you know, and to be able to run it on higher volumes, faster at scale, and use different computation engines.
Yeah, for which again, these sort of dimensionality reduction techniques are really important, so we can quickly, right at the beginning up front, reduce the size of the data.
Yeah.
Great, well, thanks, Nico. That was really good exploration. So what are we going to be doing next month? We've sort of drawn these clusters. We've allowed the user now to identify the different patterns. And really the goal is to say, well, having had the clustering techniques produce these patterns that I can take a look at and identify now particular patterns of interest that I might not otherwise have seen from this vast amount of data, we now actually want to build models. We want to build models that can identify those patterns. So next month, what we're going to be covering is an approach to modeling, which is actually in some sense very standard, just using standard sort of ensemble type techniques, but doing it in a way that's highly iterative in nature and where the human involved, the domain expert, the process engineer that you've mentioned, is actually guiding the models as they get trained. And we'll explain exactly how that worked and how we built this sort of really intuitive, interactive UI for developing those models. So that's next month. Again, third Wednesday of the month, the iterative modeling section of our project. We're not even halfway through. There's still tons more to discover in this project, which just keeps on expanding, lots of different techniques. And then we run into problems, as Nico mentioned, of scale and deployment. We'll be covering all of those in future sessions. And again, you can find previous ones on YouTube. Okay, thanks, Nico. Look forward to chatting again soon.
Yeah, thanks, Stephen.
Bye-bye.
Bye.